St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Guyana, Grenada. We hope to be working in Trinidad and Tobago very shortly. I expect some of you have been counting. Have I got to 12 yet, or have I still got to think of a couple more?
You got to 10.
Okay, right. Well, if you give me a moment, I'll get myself to 12. This is highly embarrassing for me, and I should have prepared.
What about Dominica or?
Yes, Dominica. Thank you. Apologies to anybody from Dominica there. I had a fantastic there. And please don't take the fact that you slipped my mind.
St. Kitts and Nevis, maybe?
I think I mentioned St. Kitts and Nevis. Let me just check. Barbados. How could I forget?
Barbados, right, Barbados.
And
that's what it is, yeah.
Apologies to anybody from those two countries. I really should have prepared better. Thank you for the question.
All right. We can take any questions or comments from the room for Peter. You? Yeah. Mike. Just a second, Peter. I think we have one comment at least.
Deirdre Williams from St. Lucia. Thank you very much for your presentation. Rudy Daniel brought to our attention on Civic when you launched in St. Vincent, and I congratulated him because I thought it was a Vincentian project, and he replied that it was a Commonwealth project, and I believe about the next day or so it popped up in St. Lucia, and it is a very good and useful idea, so thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the comment. There are a lot of parts of the world that would benefit from this service. We've tried to reach out to countries and do the launches in a kind of coordinated way. I would have been worried, very worried, if you had ended up saying you haven't heard anything from us yet. So thank you for reassuring me. Rest assured that we are determined through the rest of 11 months, not just to make people aware that we're there, but also get those key messages out. And we want to target particularly people and an older generation who may not be digital native in that process. But thank you for your comments, and I'm glad we're welcome, and we're proud to serve you, as we are proud to serve all those countries.
Any other questions or comments from the room? Well, I'm not seeing any, Peter, so I'll say thank you very much for the presentation, and I guess people will get in contact with you as might be required.
Absolutely, and if anybody wants to get in contact with us, then absolutely. Nigel has our details, and you'll find. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you.
All right. We'll move on to our next item now, which, as I mentioned, would be our multi-stakeholder discussion and on data protection and privacy. And this would be from the legislation and regulation point of view. And to lead that session will be here in the room Mr. Carlton Samuels, consultant. I think he said Accendi. And he'll be assisted by a remote participant, Mr. Bartlett Morgan, who is an attorney at law who practices in Barbados. So I will invite Carlton to come forward now, and please welcome him.
Morning, everybody. I have a co-presenter with me. Bartlett. Bartlett, are you there?
I am. Am I being heard?
Good, we're hearing you. Please introduce yourself.
I'm being muted by the host. So first of all, thank you everyone for having us here to present today. Just briefly, in the way of background, I am an attorney at law. I currently practice with Lex Caribbean, which is a regional law firm. And I am the lead for data protection and cybersecurity issues for my firm. And in that capacity, I've sort of been working over the past couple of years with private sector bodies and so on, just to have a sense of clarifying what their obligations are on the different legislation and what they're likely to be. And also, in other regards, I've also been involved, in drafting and getting involved with submitting commentary on data protection legislation and that kind of a thing.
Okay. Karen Bartlett.
So I'm not sure if I was being heard just now or if my audio completely went, because I saw a message suggesting that my audio may have gone for a second.
No, we don't.
No, Bartlett, continue. Just keep going.
Okay, perfect. So just by the way of introduction, that's really what I want to start off on about me. In terms of the overall conversation that we're to have today, I don't know if you want me to lead off on that, Carlton.
Yes, Bartlett, you do the recap.
Yes, perfect. So the big conversation we're really having today really centers on looking to the future, as it were. And in a sense, you could say it's more or less a sort of continuation of a conversation that actually started at the Trinidad and Tobago Internet Governance Forum in January. Because at that forum, the conversation started about the question of, well, what possibilities exist? And we had started discussing it briefly. And I suspect that today will be a more fulsome opportunity for us to sort of flesh out what that looks like. But before we get there, we thought it was important just to more or less do an update from last year, because those of you who were here last year, you recall that a big part of what we focused on was essentially doing an audit of the data protection and privacy regimes throughout the Caribbean at the broadest level, and just more or less to assess how far we've come and how much further we need to go. Because in our minds, if we have a sense of what it is we have been doing, it may also inform the bigger conversation of how we go forward. Now, just very quickly, last year, this essentially encapsulates a lot of what we would have discussed last year. If you see the slide there, it speaks to the fact that essentially within the context of CARICOM, CARIFORUM, the 24 territories associated with it. And in a broad sense, half of them have data protection legislation, half of them don't. Now, a year on, what has changed meaningfully? Now, so if you go to the next slide, what you'll realize is that after we had the Caribbean Internet Governance Forum last year, our colleagues in St. Kitts and Nevis passed an act. And so that's added to the numbers now. And in addition, Jamaica would have tabled legislation, and Barbados has twice since tabled legislation, because just around the time of the Caribbean IGF last year, Barbados had tabled legislation. And since then, they've gone back, they've retooled the bill, and they've tabled literally maybe a week ago, or we're in the process of tabling an updated version of their proposed Data Protection Act. And perhaps if time permits towards the end, it may come back around in the discussion later on. But certainly just by way of observation, it certainly fits in with the trends that we would have identified from last year, which is newer legislation tends to have much, much heavier fines than in prior decades. And they tend to have more forward-looking features, things like breach notification and so on. And a lot of those fundamental features are in fact featured in that new bill that I had a look at the other day. Now, also, just by way of mention, the British Virgin Islands, they've started their conversation about putting in place a Data Protection Act. Naturally, being an offshore jurisdiction where international business is a big part of their economy, it would make sense for them to put in place legislation like this, given the sensitive information that passes through the jurisdiction. Now, interestingly enough, and again, this is another sort of very recent development, typically when we have conversations about data protection in the Caribbean, we tend to be focused on legislation. There was a court case in Jamaica very recently called Robinson versus the Attorney General of Jamaica. And this case has sort of sent, you could say, ripples throughout the region, because what has happened is that the Constitutional Court in Jamaica, they had a look at a piece of legislation referred to as NIDS. It was legislation on the National Identification System that was being proposed in Jamaica. And in effect, at the end of the decision, they struck down the entire legislation as being unconstitutional. But for our purposes, why this decision is important is because the judges all agreed that constitutions typical to the kind you find in the Commonwealth Caribbean, they include an inherent right to privacy, even if it isn't spelled out. So I admit, as some of you would be aware, the sort of prevailing accepted approach, certainly in the Caribbean, has always been that if your constitution doesn't explicitly provide you with the right, then you don't have that constitutional right. And so they've sort of turned that proposition on its head by saying privacy is so fundamental to our lives in the Caribbean that it has to be implied into your constitution, even if it isn't expressly there. And they went even further to say that the three sort of fundamental sort of sub-rights that you tend to think of when you think of privacy, because generally speaking, and I guess this is important for our framing as well, when we speak of privacy, what do we really mean? Because in a real sense, privacy is really a collection of rights, and it's not one specific thing. And if you were to drill down and consider those rights in sort of basic categories, there are kind of three broad categories that privacy rights tend to fall into. There is privacy of the person, of your physical person, which is a different right from informational privacy, which is what we tend to speak about when we speak about things like data protection and so on, which in of itself is different from the third category, which is privacy of your choices. You know, if I decide to vote for X person in my elections, nobody should be in the ballot box and see who I voted for, essentially. And so that court case is really seminal because it said that all three of those privacy rights are fundamental and they're inherent in constitutions similar to the kind that we have in most Commonwealth Caribbean countries. Now, the implication of this going forward is that it now sort of opens a sort of floodgate for persons, if there is no sort of legislation in place already, to use a constitution as a route of vindicating your right to privacy. Now, obviously, this is very important in the digital era in which we live now, but it does still have limitations. And I don't want to sort of belabor the point too much, because this really is just kind of giving you the context of what's going on right now. But keep in mind that very often, depending on how your constitution is set up, you may only have the ability to enforce this right against government actors, you know, a relevant government ministry or agency that you perceive to have breached some privacy-related right of yours. You may now have a constitutional right of action against them, but not necessarily against another actor, everyday person in society, that kind of a thing. So, having said that, in the global landscape, between last year when we presented and now, what have we really been seeing? And we've been seeing more or less two major developments, in my view. And the first of which, obviously, is that more and more countries are, in fact, passing data protection legislation. Importantly, you know, there will be much mention made of the California Consumer Privacy Act in California in the United States. And Brazil also would have signed into law their federal data protection law as well, which was published in maybe August last year after a meeting. And it is to come into effect 2 years hence. So in 2020, that law is to come into effect. Importantly also, in terms of the global landscape, India has actually put legislation on the tables in their parliament for consideration right now. And India is interesting because that case that I mentioned in Jamaica, a big part of the basis for them making the decision that they did was that, well, this is the same approach that the Indian Supreme Court took, because India, like some countries in the Caribbean still, there was no comprehensive data protection legislation sort of affording you a right to privacy in respect of your personal information. And so they went the constitutional route, and that's the route that was followed in Jamaica, and which we expect to be followed in other jurisdictions in the Caribbean going forward. Now, so they've tabled legislation. Now, and also we know that there are conversations also in Indonesia, in Honduras, in Kenya, and also in Zimbabwe now about getting legislation in place. So there's definitely a trend towards more and more countries sort of, so you could almost say there's a snowballing effect, because as it stands today, May 3rd, we're now up to 132 countries in the world that have comprehensive data protection legislation on the books, which is significant. Now, the other major issue that we've noticed going on is that the fines are a lot tougher than they were before. So, I mean, you'd probably recall from the news recently where the French Data Protection Authority, they would have fined a major entity 50 million euros. I mean, this is no joke. But as we would have identified last year, this is in fact the trend towards larger and larger fines. And the more legislation is passed, the more the legislation will allow for larger fines to be levied. So again, to use the example of the Barbados Data Protection Bill that has just been floated, it went from having one of the lowest proposed fines throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean in the prior iteration to now having one of the highest fines throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean, because they propose to fine you up to $500,000 Barbados dollars, which is $250,000 US, which is among the highest fines that would be available to a party in the Caribbean right now. And there are other examples like this. Obviously, we would have seen last week in the news where certain filings would have suggested that Facebook has set aside at least $3 billion for possible fines from the Fair Trading Commission in the United States. Go ahead, Carlton.
5 billion.
Yes, 5 billion. But the point being, people now have to, entities throughout the world now have to take data protection more seriously and have to account for enforcement against them. It's no longer the era where this is just a nice novelty. This isn't like, for example, in the 90s, where back then perhaps it was only Australia that was really taking a serious approach to legislating around data protection and so on. This is the new normal now, that you have to take data protection seriously. Both private actors and governmental actors, we now have to take it more seriously given the consequences that are in effect right now. Now, I think that pretty much covers the sort of background or framing of what has gone on in the past year or so to sort of bring us all up to speed on where we are now. And now this allows us, I think, to go into what is to be an open discussion. And although Carlton and I will be leading it, it really is expected to be a discussion with everyone in the room about going forward, what are our possible options here in the region around data protection. And I would frame it in this way, because the question or the problem that we're trying to solve is this. In my view, and this is literally just my view of it, I would happily welcome your own ideas of what the underlying issues are. But to my mind, it is this: how do we achieve more or less a standard law in a regional system that is based on individual state sovereignty and still celebrates the differences that we have here in the region? So in other words, how do we harmonize while still accepting the reality that, well, we're all sovereign states and we have our different nuances and different things that we prefer and different approaches that we may want to take to specific issues, but at the same time acknowledging that there are huge benefits to be derived from having a common approach, potentially, to data protection. That is the underlying issue. And so in that context, I really just want to sort of create the overall framework, as it were, or rather to outline what the accepted frameworks are for thinking about questions to do with harmonization. Now, there are two broad schools of thought about how one could think about the question of harmonization of laws and processes across states. You know, if you were to speak to a pure public international law academic, they would tell you that there are 5 accepted approaches. Now, if you speak to more sort of practical, day-to-day practitioners, entities like UNCITRAL and so on, they would tell you that really it amounts to 3 different approaches. And I would suggest that in a real sense, the truth is in the middle. So briefly, and hopefully without you know, I mean, killing everybody with too much academic theory, let's just quickly cover down what the accepted approaches are in public international theory to harmonization.
Bartlett, before we get to that,
Yes.
let's keep that powder dry for a minute. Before we get to that, maybe we can have some questions from the audience to kind of frame the next discussion. 3 things that we want to probably just mention. Bartlett mentioned the case on Robinson versus the Attorney General of Jamaica. What is interesting about that case is that their lordships made their judgment on the dissent from the Indian Supreme Court. So it was the dissenter in the Indian court case that actually informed the Jamaican judgment, not the majority decision in the Indian Supreme Court.
Yes.
First thing. The second thing that you need to bear in mind is that the movement for more data protection legislation around the world tends to be using the European model for data protection, which is a GDPR, General Data Protection, GDPR regulation, General Data Protection Regulations. So the models we see emerging around the world is based on the GDPR. And the third thing that we should emphasize in this discussion, and Bartlett mentioned it early on, is that if you look at the legislation around the world, they actually mirror the 3 broad focal points for privacy. Privacy of the person, privacy in information, privacy in choices. So those things are very important for the overall discussion as to what might be a role that we would play. Kevin, you raise your hand. Do you have a mic for Kevin? Nobody? Right.
Hi, thanks, Carlton. Kevin Swift-Lacknick. I was just trying to ask these questions, just following up from some of the points Bartlett was making, and I think it could probably add to the debate. Bartlett, thanks for the presentation. You were saying that you're pointing out the territories that are developing data protection legislation. And I know right now, for instance, there is a public policy effect from access providers and internet intermediaries that provide services. So they are protections for citizens by virtue of the contracts that they have and the penetration of their services. Are there any statutory instruments being developed in the Caribbean that work against the level of protections that citizens are being afforded by these intermediaries or access providers? So it's just a general question. It's also curiosity. And the second question I had was, I'm thinking a bit of the whole story about levies for universal service, and I'm wondering, what does a Caribbean DPA do with a multi-billion-dollar fine? What's the life cycle of that?
Good question. Deirdre, you wanted to? No? Anybody else want to ask a question? Yes? No? Yes, Bartlett, you want to answer, or should I take a stab at it?
Yes. Well, I'll take a stab at the first one. Kevin, if I understood your first question correctly, was it really about whether or not there are statutory instruments in the Caribbean that more or less the effect of them is to limit the privacy rights relative to the intermediaries? Is that a fair framing?
Well, it's whether any of these statutory instruments affect in some way the level of protections that people are already getting from non-state actors. And that could be for a philosophical reason. It doesn't have to be out of ignorance. There could be like a philosophical argument why the state would say that this needs to happen, and it may appear as an administrative burden to a service provider.
Okay, let me take a stab at it. The major area where that comes into play is the data protection, in the consumer protection legislation. Consumer protection legislation in the Caribbean, some of them are, you have Barbados, fair trading, you have Jamaica with the Fair Trading Act and the Consumer Protection Act. We have one. In the law, there is some coverage for consumer against intermediaries. The problem has always been enforcement. The regulations, for example, I don't know if you've been following a case where the Fair Trading Commission of Jamaica took one of the service providers to court, and the service provider's defense was, well, you don't have any standing to take us to court. It is actually the other guy, the other regulator, because we're a telecommunications provider. It was a dodge, but the judges, of course, threw that out, and they're still trying to figure out how to bring that to a close. The real issue for us in the region is that where there's consumer protection legislation, the regulations are weak to non-existent. And where there is the will to go to court is not there. That's how I would answer that.
Yes.
But the second one is a little broader, and that requires your kind of legal expertise on it. You want to take a stab at it? You don't recall what the question was? Mm-hmm.
So my challenge is the audio froze for maybe about 10 seconds just now, and I suspect I missed the crescendo.
All right, Kevin, you want to replay the question? I think it's interesting, the question. I think you have an answer for it.
Okay. Yeah, so I had a nice flashback down memory lane to levies for universal service across the Caribbean. So my question is, what does a Caribbean DPA do with a multi-million-dollar fine?
So it's riffing on the fact that the fines are going up, and if we have DPA commissioners, we have structures that can accept the fine, what will they do with the fines, right? Other than put it in this consolidated fund.
Well, so here's the thing. So there is this sort of conundrum with data protection authorities generally. And actually, the Caribbean is a good place to sort of describe that situation, which is this. If you look throughout much of the Commonwealth Caribbean, in those jurisdictions that have data protection legislation on the books, either the DP hasn't been appointed, or if they've been appointed, they're under-resourced. Now, the problem is, well, if you don't have resources, you can't go out and levy more fines. Now, this gets to the heart of your question, what happens with those fines? In reality, even though it depends on what your legislation would suggest, but in reality, it's those very fines that are levied by the DPA that tend to be used to fund the future operations of the DPA. Other jurisdictions will say, well, simply pay it into the consolidated fund and leave it up to the government to fund you and fund your budgetary requirements, going forward. But very often in reality, the prevailing trend is that those fines fund the DPA. And that is the reality of what would likely happen with these huge fines. That is the reality of it. And now that could be a bad thing, a good thing, depending on how you look at it. To my mind, it means that if you levy meaningful fines that fit the offense, it then puts you in a position to properly resource your authority, more staff, more technical resources to do audits, that kind of a thing, which means that you have an environment over the course of time which is more likely to abide by the obligations laid down in data protection legislation. And in that sense, it's a good thing. I imagine you could argue that it's also a bad thing because, well, you're sort of just existing for the sake of, collecting fines, which in of itself, in a philosophical sense, is not necessarily a good end, and perhaps those funds may be better used elsewhere. And hence the need for a consolidated fund where the government, based on its relevant policies of the day, can decide what to do with those funds.
Yes, so that is a conundrum for our situation of the fines. In places where you have the commissioner, I think there's one to be appointed. The one was recently appointed in the Bahamas, and they're fully functional office over there. They are grappling with how you fund it, and I think across the Caribbean we'll have the same thing. But this is exactly as Bartlett says, it's the intent always is about these offices being self-funded, and they would get the funds from fines. And so there seems to be, there might be, it's supposed to be a virtuous cycle, but the cycle could be corrupted, the corrupt intent. And that's always existential in these areas. Yes, Deirdre.
Yes, Deirdre Williams. Thank you, Bartlett. It's nice to meet you at last. I've known you at the other end for years and years and years.
Yes.
My question goes back, in fact, to the first presentation and Mr. Davies' jets that crossed the dateline. And I'm wondering, is it possible, what measures are taken to imagine the legislation so that, in fact, it does continue to protect in the rapidly advancing future where our privacies may be being invaded in ways that we don't even imagine now?
Good. That's a very good question.
Yes.
And maybe
So,
that's how
Carlton,
segue. Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
There is a sort of, I believe that a part of the answer to that, and I'm in fact wary of using the word answer, but so let me go no further than to say, my assessment of it is that perhaps the way of resolving that unknown future dilemma is to take a slightly different approach to legislating in the region. And here's what I mean. If you know that the parameters are going to be changing more rapidly than they otherwise would, it means then that you need a legislative mechanism that also rapidly adopts. Now, what that could mean in a practical sense is similar to what is being debated in Jamaica right now in respect of their proposed data protection legislation, which is to ensure that there is a requirement in the legislation itself to review at certain intervals, at set intervals. And so in theory, at least, it means that if every 5 years, your legislators are forced to go back to the drawing board to consider the environment, consider the impact of the legislation, and consider the impact of new technologies, then it means then that you're able to keep up with the times. I mean, I would have to sort of, paint the other side of the picture as well, because there's also a competing a view of legislating, even in the digital era, which says that you ought not, but certainly in the context of Commonwealth Caribbean countries, let me make that distinction. It's perhaps a bit different in civil law jurisdictions, but certainly in the context of Commonwealth Caribbean jurisdictions who subscribe more or less to the common law, that you ought not to over-legislate and leave it up to the case law to sort of move with the times. So even though the legislation itself would more or less remain, broadly the same, and perhaps, you're only looking at maybe increasing the fines over the years, what you can look at is using the case law, interpreting that legislation to do the moving with times for you. That is an alternate view of how it can work. Yes.
Right. So that means that you only legislate principles, principles. And then you use, once you legislate, it's just the high principles, you use the case law to determine how that evolves. and then you have this review of the legislation as you go along. So that's the way you grow into it. But Bartlett, I wanted you to get back to what you were going to say about the three main areas that we see this evolving
Yes.
region, to answer that question. So that's only a part of it. So continue with that.
Yes. So where I was earlier was I wanted to more or less frame the accepted kind of theoretical approaches to harmonization. So there are leading thinkers and practitioners who would tell you that in a real sense, there are three practical approaches to achieving harmonization in the modern era. One, it would be via what you call hard law, which is, you know, your legislation. And then outside of that, it would be soft law in the sense of things like model laws or agreed principles and norms that, you know, you leave it up to individual states to implement as they see fit. And then the third approach is, well, having agreed standard contractual clauses that everyday individuals and businesses and so on can use when they're doing businesses across borders. And we'll accept that these standard clauses mean certain things, and they'll have certain provisions and so on to ensure that the way the economies work across borders is in and of itself harmonized, the way the goods and services flow and so on. So that is kind of more practical framing of it.
We'll come back to it. Bartlett, you got a little muffled in the first broad the plan. Just say it.
Okay.
Nigel didn't hear it, so I think others might not have heard it.
Yes. So, in brief, there are three, depending on the approach you take. There is the more sort of academic approach in public international law, which says there are 5 approaches. And then there's a more practical, pragmatic approach, which tends to be adopted by bodies actually involved with things like creating harmonized legislation. And those practical bodies, people like UNCITRAL will tell you that there are 3 approaches, which is legislative, contractual, and via explanatory means. So the explanatory would be the soft law stuff like, legal guides or agreed principles. The contractual stuff would be contractual clauses. And then the legislative means would be things like model laws and legislative or treaty provisions. That's their
treaties. Yes, so we have the 3 areas, and you should know that around the world there are examples of all of them. And in the Caribbean, some of you might be familiar with one approach. Who remember HIPCAR? How many people remember HIPCAR? Okay, so we have a few people remember HIPCAR in the room. HIPCAR approach was the one that used the model legislation. Remember that? So model legislation was developed and it was promulgated around the region, and then the legislative assemblies were supposed to take that up and tropicalize them. I use the word tropicalize advisedly. Put in the local nuances as they see fit. That's the approach. So we are familiar with that one. The other one, of course, is a treaty legislation. The CSME, for example, is that approach. Yes. You agree on a basic set of principles and rules, and everybody is supposed to develop, again, some kind of cooperative framework to make that work. And so we're familiar with the movement of people on the CSME and so on. So we do have some examples in the region of how that approaches. The big one, and I think Bartlett can go here even deeper, is the major challenge in all of this is to understand what principles are shared, what are the normatives for sharing certain principles, how you're going to implement them, how you enforce them. Oh, and the other one, of course, is having a regional enforcement mechanism. So we have that enforcement mechanism. And we also have an example of that. People are familiar with impacts, yes? Impacts, right? You remember what happened when we had the World Cup cricket? You remember what happened there? And there was very quickly, they adopted in getting people moving through across borders, right? By harmonizing how they treat them at the border and so on. So that is one other way of doing it. Yeah.
At the same time as HIPCA, there was a World Bank funded project doing something similar, but in a much less transparent manner. I know we had it in St. Lucia. Half of our ICT type legislation went to HIPCA and the other half went to the World Bank project. I wonder, is it necessary, do you know about the World Bank project, and is it necessary to talk about what they were doing just a little bit?
I think I know which one you're talking about. It's the e-grip project, the part of the e-grip thing. The real issue with that was that the focus is a lot different. That e-grip project was intended, first of all, to find a harmonized way to define identity, right? And out of that, they were supposed to have some common approach to procurement and marketing and so on. For what it was trying to do, I think it was fairly successful. What has happened is, again, is about the devil is in the details, the implementation details. You know, everybody's sovereign, and everybody want to have their little piece of thinking involving the framework and the implementation framework. So it got frittered away at the edges. I think that's the best way to say that. But the approach itself is still consonant with the generally agreed ways to get how you get to do these things. You know, it demands side of collaborative approach, understanding, recognizing agreed principles and norms, and creating frameworks for implementing them. That is the way it is, and it turned out the other way. There are places in the world where this has happened quite well. If you look at, we talk about the thing is that what we see around the world is that common economic conditions tend to work well into implementing these broad regional frameworks. So, for example, in West Africa, you have them trying to have a common regional approach to data protection, and they have a common regional approach to the enforcement of the data protection law. And in Southern Africa Development Cooperation Council, and so on. They are driven in part by trying to harmonize with the trading blocs, primarily European trading blocs. You have the Francophone countries in West Africa developing a common approach, and they're all kind of influenced by the European view of what data protection is, because they also have trading relationships that they wish to nurture with the European bloc. So these things tend to kind of track the economic interests of states as we go along. It's not unusual. What is important for us to understand is that we have to agree on norms and principles, then we find a way to implement along that line. Yes, Nigel.
Yes, Bartlett, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Of the 12 Caribbean countries, I think it was 12 you said, how many of them had data protection?
Yes, in that region.
Yeah, somewhere around that.
Mm.
But this is the Caribbean we're speaking of, not Commonwealth Caribbean.
Right, yeah, Commonwealth Caribbean.
Yeah.
From the standpoint of harmonization, are they similar? Are they using similar approaches? Are they easily disposed towards harmonization and that sort of thing?
So the answer is yes, but with an asterisk. So one of the points that Carlton touched on earlier, which is actually very important, is the overall approach that we've taken, certainly in the Caribbean, towards legislating for data protection. And so what you'll find is that a lot of the fundamental principles that we tend to put in legislation as being fundamental principles that ought to be protected and observed by data controllers tend to be more or less identical, coming from the kind of European roots of data protection with those accepted principles. I mean, not keeping data for longer than you need it, that kind of a thing. And so in that sense, if you were to literally pull up a dashboard of all the legislation across the region, the underlying principles tend to be the same. Where there's huge divergence in the region, though, is in terms of things like the enforcement mechanisms, in terms of the fines that are levied across the region.
Sanctions.
Yes. And also the scope, because, for example, you have at one extreme, St. Vincent, that only applies the data protection regime to governmental actors.
Yes.
Right?
No.
Yes. So that's one of the funny things about the St. Vincent Act that we've always found interesting. They were early out of the gate, and perhaps that was why, but they targeted theirs only at governmental institutions, whereas others would focus more on private actors as well as governmental institutions. Yeah. And so those are where you tend to have the shades of difference. And also, what you'll realize that if you were to plot the legislation on a graph in terms of a timeline, you'll realize that those that came out in the Caribbean, perhaps in the earlier part, they don't have things like breach notification mechanisms built into the act. But the newer ones over the past maybe 4 or 5 years, most of them have breach notification requirements. So that's where the difference tends to come up. But the underlying principles that we say are important are more or less the same. But how we go about protecting them diverges widely.
Yes. Bartlett, the St. Vincent Act, is it, I thought it was that the government excluded themselves. Is that not true?
Okay, so no, it was the other way around from what I gather with them, which is that they limited it to their institutions. That was my understanding of it.
All right, we'll look at it again. So yes, so that's a broad outline of what we want to discuss. The first one, of course, is the agreement on norms and principles for data protection, and whether or not we are going to recognize broadly that the right to privacy exists, and what buckets of privacy we are intending to protect, whether it is the person, privacy of a person, privacy of association, and so on. And thirdly, whether or not we feel that the approach to having comprehensive data protection legislation in the region would be, any of the three approaches that we generally see around the world, and whether or not we in the Caribbean will endorse any of them in this case. Yes. Question, Gary, help around there. Thank you. Bartlett, can you see the room?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Hi.
Hello.
I just wanted to share, because this is really a fascinating discussion. I just wanted to share a little bit of experience that when you think about this, I do privacy data protection and principally covering a lot of biometrics in the North American region, but principally in the US with respect to GDPR, the California rule. And for what it's worth, I just want to share right now, it's really controversial in the US. We have 3 biometric laws that are state laws, California, Texas, and an East Coast state.
Yes.
And the recent one from California, which is very distinctively different, it's a consumer law. But right now, the industry is trying to push for a federal law that is much weaker than the state laws.
Yes.
And as you know, biometrics in the US is defined also in GDPR. It's not only voice recognition, it's iris, it's hands, it's facial,
Yes.
and others that are coming. And they're in, at least in our country, they're being pulled off of Facebook, social media without consent, and there's many cases right now. So I just wanted to share that maybe when you're thinking about definitions, that biometrics is definitely here right now, and I would share it with respect to our experience. It's really important to encompass that in a very broad way, and GDPR does. So that's, I just wanted to share that. That's all.
That's absolutely right.
Absolutely. There's
Go ahead,
so one of the prevailing points that we made last year in last year's presentation, when we sort of did an audit of the whole region, was that the newer legislation being passed, you know, in Cayman, Bermuda, and the bills you see out of Jamaica and now in Barbados, they tend to embrace a more European style approach. And so again, I've been sort of, you know, giving some amount of plaudits to the drafters of the latest draft of the Barbados Data Protection Bill, the 2019 draft, because they had public consultations, and one of the things that members of the public and different civil society bodies identified was that the notion of sensitive personal data didn't include stuff like biometrics and so on. And so this latest draft does in fact include that as a basis for protecting data. But in a way, this conversation kind of spills back to the general conversation we're having, which is, well, we see individually some jurisdictions moving towards or keeping in line with the modern trends, but what about those who've already passed legislation 10 years and 15 years ago? I mean, what do you do about the rights of citizens in those jurisdictions, you know, who don't have these broad definitions of sensitive personal data, or in some cases, there's no definition of sensitive personal data or specific protection for it in those legislations going back 10 and 15 years. And that is a part of what we need to grapple with right now in the Caribbean in terms of harmonization.
Yes. Any other yes, another comment? Yes, so we have this development, this recognition, and the California law. If you have a chance to look at the California law, it is very expansive, and Washington State is also putting a new law, and I follow these very closely because you look for the principles that they tend to enunciate. But thank you for bringing up the point that definitions are absolutely critical to these laws. The legal frameworks, definitions are absolutely critical. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes it's the definitional parts of it that creates the most noise comes out of the definitional aspects of it. So that's one of the things that we want to get into. Norms and principles. We have to agree on a set of definitions that encompass the law and move forward on that basis. Yes. The other thing that, and Bartlett mentioned it earlier, that the first wave of data protection legislation, if you look across the Caribbean, they were very weak on things like breach notification, Bartlett. Well, probably because they didn't have any real authority. The authority portion of the law was never really implemented. So things like breach notification. What else, Bartlett, did we see?
So definitely sensitive personal data was not defined in a lot of the earlier legislation. And so those were two of the fundamental things. In some cases, there were almost non-existent fines in the early legislation. So zero to almost no fines in some cases. Well, no fines in one case, and in others, the fines were limited.
Yeah. So those things hinged on the authority, the promulgation of the authoritative instruments and the framework to enforce the law. So those things are very common, and we should look for them. Yes, Deirdre.
I'm going back again. I was involved in the HIPCA negotiation business in St. Lucia, and I remember particularly the privacy legislation. And the consultant was from Germany.
Yes.
And while we were discussing this, he said, but in 25 years, nobody's going to bother about privacy. This is before we learn to distrust the internet. And I went back, I was teaching, this is within the last 10 years, I went back to my afternoon class, and before I began, I asked them, and my apologies to people in the room, I asked them, how many of you use Facebook? And all hands went up. And how many of you are concerned about keeping things about you private? And all the hands went up. And the fact that these two things might be mutually incompatible didn't seem to be occurring to people then. Now we're all running scared. 5 years down the line, where are we going to be?
Yes, that's true. But you see, one of the things that we have to grapple with always is that the platforms were positioned as tools for forming communities. And generally speaking, when you're in your community, you tend to have a certain sense of who you are and what's supposed to happen. And you never much think about the other things because, you know, you're with your tribe, as it were. And once very negative things started coming about, people started thinking that the role of the platforms in forming communities are to be suspect, right? The platforms, as platforms, still enable communities, but the concept of community is what has kind of moved a little bit. And maybe that's what we want to kind of address, to see how that we have kind of you know, moved along this continuum of what is community and what are the attributes of community. And maybe that's where we are right now in the debate, trying to figure out what it is. You're quite right. Anybody ever seen the privacy legislation, model legislation that came out of HIPCA? Anybody ever seen it? Yeah, you should look at it. It's around. It's there. It's one of the you know, some work. But here's the thing with it, and this is my personal view. I wouldn't want to think that it is considered that it is any group view, but my personal view. Law tends to be informed by culture. Where you are, your place in the world, your corner of the world, and the things that happen, who determine who we are and how we interact with each other and so on. And if you look, there was a really good attempt to moderate the cultural elements that could creep into law, legislation. There was really a great attempt to do that. But if you look at it closely, you will see a few spurs, right? A few spores that are culturally not from this area. You will see that. And it's not that it's not useful, but you have to be mindful that when you're looking at this model legislation, that you could see some footprints from elsewhere. And yes, that the intent always was that the model legislation would have been taken by each country, and we would have gone through it and tore it apart and put it together again, and then we would infuse it with some of our own acculturations. That is where we fell down. But I say this to say that the approach to a regional framework for data protection, we are very mindful that some of these cultural footprints can kind of creep into it, seep into it, and it is for us to be mindful of it and minimize that as much as is possible. Yes, and we have two at the back, Deborah and Dev.
I have a little question on that comment, only because it's a global world.
Yes.
And as you know, GDPR applies around the world to any European citizen.
Mhm.
So I know that for companies in certain parts of the world, whether we like it or not, in our subsidiary companies, we have to comply with GDPR.
Yes.
Because we're dealing with Europeans. And I very much appreciate how important it is to have regional flavor. That's diversity, and that's the gift to the world, right, of the Caribbean. But so much of this data protection has become global. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more, if you could clarify more, what does that mean exactly when you talk about the cultural? How does that play out in regional harmonization and legislation? What does that look like?
Okay. Let me hear from Dev first before we attempt to.
Well, yes, I'm following a little bit about the GDPR. One of the things in the GDPR is this thing about the right to be forgotten. And I was wondering, is this concept gaining traction in the Caribbean or not?
It's a good question. Any other, Kevin?
Just to add to that, that right to be forgotten, I think it's purely tied to a European historic event.
Yes.
So I think that might be the distinction as to how we in the Caribbean might think about that concept. So again, the Caribbean imperatives for data protection,
Yes.
for privacy.
I'm glad that came up, because that's one cultural example that the right to be forgotten. In our view, well, you know, I had a boss one tell me it's better to be talked about than not. It seems to us that the right to be forgotten, especially in a digital age, is a little cockeyed. So that's one cultural thing. The other thing that, for example, hate speech, hate laws, from the European historical antecedents, you could understand how the hate laws come in. For example, Nazi propaganda, and the Germans are very big on this, and carry on. And the thinking that emerged from that also colors the GDPR. And this is the kind of thing that we would have a different view on, because we have a different cultural and historical antecedent. They're, for example, lèse-majesté laws that says that you can't say nothing about the king or the consort, you know. And those exist, for example, in Southeast Asian monarchies, you know, Thailand and Japan and so on. You say anything about the empire, you could get shot. So these kinds of things, broadly speaking, how they play out in legislation, how they play out in the model may be different, but you got to be mindful that some of these models are tainted by historical and cultural antecedents. And, you know, there's a whole set of them, including this one, the right to be forgotten. I don't know how people feel about it, but yes, Deidre.
I'm really sorry, but you say tainted.
Yes.
In the example of hate speech, aren't we supposed to learn from our history? If it was possible to harness what existed then to broadcast hate speech and to reach the end that was reached, surely we need to remember about that so that we don't do it all over again. The fact that it hasn't happened yet does not mean that it cannot happen. And I will confess, I started off in Europe, so maybe I'm tainted as well.
I quite agree that we should be mindful of it. I quite agree. What I'm saying is that the legislative intent that we have for our laws, you must be mindful of these things and see how they play out in the way you model the legislation. This is not to say that you should ignore them, but you should be very mindful of what the impact is and how the law actually grew out of that, and the contours of the law. And therefore the implementation and the enforcement and all of these things that come down the line from that. I think it's important for you to know those things so that even if you're going to be influenced by them, then the things that you take from them, you should be very mindful of how they play out down the way. That's the point I wanted to emphasize.
Yes. So Carlton, if I may jump in just for a second.
Yes.
Yeah, so I want to double back. There was a question framed earlier, I believe it was by Deborah, which was essentially asked, well, in the kind of global environment that we're operating in now in respect of data protection and so on, well, what does culture look like in specific legislation? My short answer to that is that the best way to ascertain what how a country's sort of culture or worldview it comes out in its data protection legislation is to consider how it treats to the concept of a sensitive personal data. That tends to be the best, in my estimation, barometer of what the country's views are or how it seeks to localize what is otherwise a more or less generic field of endeavor. And so, for example, there are some jurisdictions that will deliberately not include sexual orientation as a sensitive personal data consideration. There are others who will deliberately not include or include things like trade union membership. And these are just examples just to kind of broadly suggest that you can use that to have a sense of how people tend to localize legislation. To Dev's question, he had essentially asked if there was any traction for the whole right to be forgotten. The general answer is no, but asterisk. In Barbados' latest draft, they're proposing what amounts to the right to be forgotten, essentially. That's how I read it. So it would appear that there is one example of it in a draft bill, but generally, it generally hasn't had much uptake in the Caribbean.
How new is that one, Bartlett, that revision? I haven't seen that one.
Well, you wouldn't have, because it's literally hot off the press. Like within maybe the last 4 to 5 days is when it was approved by cabinet, and it is now being tabled in Parliament. So you're getting the very exclusive hot take information here.
All right, good.
Yes.
I have been following that very closely. I can't recall the thing, but this is the kind of thing that you want to be aware of and look at and see what the implications are for all of us. The other thing that I wanted to senior moment. It went straight out of my head. It'll come back. Not to worry, it'll come back. It'll return. This is something I wanted to follow up on Bartlett.
Was it to do with the sensitive personal data or the right to be forgotten?
The sensitive information.
Yes, and what we need to put into the legislation.
Yes, what you put in the legislation, because, for example, in places where trade unions and political affiliations they sometimes use they use different things to mean something else. So, for example, in some places, trade union being identified as a trade unionist also is used to identify your political affiliations. So you're a trade unionist, you are a leftist, and then therefore, you are probably an agitator. or you are inclined to overthrow the state, and so on. So these kinds of things, and these are cultural things too, you know, that comes into play. You have to be mindful of the stand-ins that can be interpreted as different things. That's one thing I want to say. There's another thing that comes to mind, but it'll come back. So we've gone an hour into this discussion. Huh?
Yeah.
Say
A kind of a framing comment here.
yes.
In the context of the CIGF,
Yes.
our product typically is a policy framework or policy recommendations kind of a thing. I'm thinking what might be our aspiration as far as what might be aspiration of the CIGF as far as data protection and privacy is concerned? Is it that we should be trying to build some regional consensus on certain principles that we all around the Caribbean ought to have in our legislation? And could we identify those things? And if so, how might we go about doing that? For example, in the cybersecurity world, there was a special effort to create, not necessarily by the full CIGF, but by a special interest group, I suppose, within the Caribbean, to create a cybersecurity policy framework with some expert assistance. We have some examples in the Caribbean of data protection laws already, and others still to come on board. Maybe, this is a suggestion I'm throwing out, maybe we could think about trying to not codify, but identify certain principles that we would recommend be included in all of our regional legislative frameworks. Or how else might we, from the CIGF point of view, seek to address this topic?
So that is a question for everybody in the room. Dev, you wanted to say something?
Hi. Well, it's not from me, but from Abri Marsh, who's following it remotely. So his question is, or comment, with us going to the single ICT space, how does single ICT inform the harmonization of our data protection laws? Kind of what Nigel is saying. And his follow-up question is, if I give my data to one territory, does it mean other territories have a right to it or access to it?
All good questions. Well, tell the truth, we always saw this within the construct of the single ICT space, because in the digital environment, this is where we think the rubber hits the road. So we're not sure how we're going to execute, but we certainly believe that this is something that is very much to be embraced within the framework of the single ICT space. So that is to answer Agri. We agree on that. We're just not sure what the modality is, and maybe that's where we need to have this conversation in this room and elsewhere to kind of define a way forward. Bartlett?
Yes, I wanted to jump in there because the general flavor of the questions in the last round seemed to be, well, where do we go from here, essentially, and how? Now, you recall earlier in the conversation, we had sort of laid out that, there are broad different approaches. You could, do harmonization of legislation, which you've already tried. You could go to the level of treaties and so on. But here's a reality that we have to confront, which makes this a challenging conversation. No one approach is more or less ideal. And it may perhaps be too early, arguably, to even make a strong recommendation for one approach or the other. Now, Because, for example, if you were to say, well, let's go the route of a treaty, a convention of sorts, a Caribbean convention on data protection. Okay, well, it sounds nice in theory, but then this goes back to the point that was raised by Deirdre about, well, the unknown future. What happens when you fix on certain principles and said, this is the hard law in all the jurisdictions in the Caribbean, and then you realize after you've implemented it that certain aspects of it just aren't fit for the reality that we exist in. It's extremely hard to change treaty or to amend the treaty obligations, because then you have to get everybody to go back and file, instruments and that kind of thing, and just see to it all over again. And so it can be challenging in that regard. Now, as our lived experience has demonstrated, simply doing things like harmonize model data, sometimes it may not have the effect that you think it will have, in that sometimes people may not actually implement it at all, or the implementation, when you compare different implementations, they're so far apart that you can't actually say that we have in fact harmonized certain aspects of the regime. Now, what in my view, there are certain things that practically we can start thinking about now. And it goes back to an issue that was sort of raised by Kevan's question, which has to do with this whole idea of perhaps regional enforcement authorities. Why? Because individually, as the experience has shown, we don't have the resources to do things like that on our own. And so if we all chip in a little bit to have a collective authority that's then well-resourced to operate throughout the jurisdictions, and the relevant legislation is amended to allow for their existence and operation, then that may be a practical win in the way of harmonizing going forward. But perhaps even more base than that is that I think it's important at this juncture for us to agree on what are the principles that we think are important. Whether those principles will end up in a treaty or in model laws, or merely in simply legislative guidance notes. The important thing is for us to agree on what is important to us as a region right now. Now, I mean, Carlton and I have certain suggestions, but I would put it to you that it's up to you guys also to sort of refine or even add to that, or, where the suggestions might be bad to ask that they not be considered. Now, for example, based on the stuff that we've been looking at over the past couple of years, we would say that at a bare minimum, you need about 6 things as sort of agreed principles or norms, as it were. One is an independent data protection authority, not just an authority, one that is independent. Because if a data protection authority is not independent from the government, it probably won't be as aggressive in its approach to enforcement. And that's the reality of it. We also need to ensure, and this goes back to those jurisdictions that already passed legislation early in the game, in the first wave, that there is a separate definition of sensitive personal data. Regardless of what each country may believe should be encapsulated in that definition, it is important that you have it. Because the truth is, without that distinction, then the more sort of rigid protection that you require for sensitive personal data, the kind of stuff people can use against you, so to speak, to harm you, then you won't have that. So the other thing that we think is important is, in any event, in any modern rights respecting society, when it comes to data protection, you ought to have breach notification provisions, and especially time-bound breach notification provisions. Because if you simply say a party must notify a relevant authority or the data subject that there's been a breach, then, well, that party can choose to interpret that to mean, well, a year after the fact, which isn't very useful. So it's important to have time-bound breach notification. We would also say that's important, and again, this goes back to the earlier jurisdictions that have passed legislation without it, or those jurisdictions that don't have right now, which is to have meaningful sanctions and fines incorporated into the legislation. I think regardless of how you look at it, the trend tends to be that where the fines are significant, then data controllers tend to take their obligations seriously for fear of being fined. The other thing that we'd want to recommend for consideration is that there ought to be transparency in the collection and transmission of personal information. It's not enough to simply say you're collecting my data. I ought to know what you're doing with it and why and where you're storing my data and where you're sending it. I ought to know that if I want to know. Now, the final thing is that we would suggest that there ought to be built into any sort of framework going forward as a principle, more or less audit trails for consent that must be maintained. In other words, if a data protection authority comes knocking at the door of a data controller, that data controller should be able to demonstrate, well, here's what I've been doing to ensure that persons consent to me collecting their personal information. And those, in our view, based on what we've seen so far in the Caribbean, are sort of like the baseline principles that we can all agree ought to be in any data protection legislation that we pass going forward.
Yes, and one other thing, Bartlett, you skipped over do we also feel that any legislation must have in the legislation some mechanism for review of the legislation after a certain period of time?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, Bartlett, Nigel, Casimir. I think what you just enumerated is like what I was looking for, things that some sort of principles probably we could put out and for consideration and maybe see if we have consensus in the CIGF that we could probably carry those forward. So thanks for that.
Wonderful.
Yes, sir, at the back. Again, remember, we see this as very integral to articulation of the single ICT space.
Thank you. Rodney Taylor, Ministry of Innovation, Barbados. I just, in terms of, Nigel is asking for principles and stuff, and I'm aware, I wasn't involved, but I'm aware of the HIPCAR process. And basically, essentially, that process didn't seem to have worked out. I understand that the legislation didn't fit with the, what's the right term? It basically did not fit with the existing legislation in the Caribbean. That is my understanding. But if there's someone who's able to elucidate on that for me, because the modern legislation already provided some guidelines, and I want to know, did we have a problem with the guidelines? Did we have a problem with the language? Was there an issue with implementation? Because it seems to me that to reinvent the wheel, right, and to be back in the same place 10 years from now, seems to me to be counterproductive. Thank you.
The quick answer to that is all of the above.
Good morning, Maria Myers Hamilton from Jamaica. Carlton, my always pet peeve with all of this, I believe sometimes laws are done in isolation.
Yes.
And the more we have conversions of technology and a need for legislation, there is a need for the technical people to be in the room when the conversation is being held. And you speak of definitions, because definitions can mean many things, as we know in ICT.
Yes.
So it's very important that we all talk to make sure that the laws are doing what they're supposed to do and not impeding innovation and technology and the growth and development of our economy.
Maria, we come from the same background, and we've known long together that this is what our view is. You probably have heard me say this before. The law is too important to leave it to lawyers. I have always felt that the way we go about legislation is wrong, even about writing regulations. I was involved in a situation right now, and they say to me that I was required to review the law so that I had an implementation framework for a process. And it was very clear to me that the law was going to be wrong because the law itself was blind in so many areas. And I said to them, you can't do that. But what I can do for you is I can write the regulations that forbear the law. So where the law I thought was pickled with the wrong approach, you can write regulations that actually demoted those considerations. And they said, well, yes, you can do that, but we need a lawyer to write it. I said, but that's a problem. You get the lawyer to write the law, and the lawyer didn't understand what the definitions were. And that was a problem. The problem was definitional. They didn't ask nobody. They went. One good thing about Bartlett, I should tell you, is that Bartlett is the ICT practitioner before he became a lawyer. And I know him a long, long time. So I know he understands. I don't have to explain to him what something means technically. He would probably be more explaining it to me. So that has always been our pet peeve, and that's one of the reasons why we get involved here in looking at these things, especially in the area of law, as we become, as Maria's talked about convergence. We've always been aware, Maria, that convergence changes the game, and the language that we speak effortlessly have to find a way into the general conversation so we have better outcomes, especially in law and legislation and regulation. That has always been a pet peeve of us. So we're quite right about that. What one comment was? Who is it that wanted to make it? Cecil? Yeah, I didn't see Cecil there.
Okay, so I was actually following on something that Maria said, and Rodney's comment. So Jamaica would have been involved in the HIPCAR process, which at the time allowed for 2 representatives from each country.
Yeah.
1 policy, 1 legal. Okay. And I think the process paid for those persons to attend. Of course, Jamaica made use of that. But in addition to that, when we came back, all the documents themselves were interrogated.
Talk to the people, sis. You're talking to me. I know the story.
All the documents themselves were interrogated by a team of technical persons, in addition to the lawyers. And the lawyers who were there were the ones who were going to be writing the law. The point I'm saying is that 10 years on, many of those HIPCAR legislation or draft templates have found themselves into the bills in Jamaica, into the laws that we actually have in Jamaica because of that approach. Many countries may not have had that, based on my memory of what I was told happened, might not have had that wide-ranging experience in terms of having multiple persons participating in the process, and that might have been what has hampered that process in and of itself. Having said that, Carlton, I agree with you. When the lawyers draft the legislation, they miss key things and key intents. And so certainly in Jamaica, a lot of the times, the draft legislation has to be vetted by the technical persons to determine if the intent, which was given by way of policy, is being met. And I can tell you that certainly when those documents come to me, and I've saved many a days having reviewed documents like that, whereby the lawyers got the intent wrong. Simple changes, which might have been global changes, to recognize that you have to step back and make a different change, because if you did this thing, the global effect would actually go against the intent that you initially had. So that was one thing. Final thing is, it's only in recent years that you had lawyers being the primary drafters. I'm from the old school, and the old school, the actual policy direction and so on are always developed by the technical persons, not the other way around.
I know that too. SG before Kevin.
Right.
Yes.
I think Cecil may have answered part of that issue that Rodney raised. But in 2012, we were when the CTU was working with the OAS to draft a Caribbean cybersecurity policy, what came out was that in many of the countries, they did not have the legal drafts people to take that model law and fit it into the local environment. And that continues to be a challenge here across the region. But I really liked what you said. You have the technical people sitting with the lawyers to explain and really explain, what the technology is about. In the absence of that, you are just shooting in the dark.
Yes, SG, that's right. Kevin.
Yes, just one quick anecdote to that effect about collaboration to draft the laws, and that would be the TNT cybercrime bill, because that was an exercise that took many years in the making, involved an interministerial committee of many capacities, technical officers, policy, law enforcement across government ministries, agencies, and private sector inserts at times. But as SG had alluded to, so that was a long process. You had a well-informed product at the time, but then the capacities to move from that aspect into the implementation, they've all since been a bit dispersed. And I think it's a perennial challenge that each Caribbean territory faces. Now you're hearing about the cybercrime bill being debated, and it's almost like if it's on fresh airs. And it's as if you're reinventing the wheel at a point where even when you have the right people in the room and you go through years, literally years, I was part of that committee, doing something, we still don't get to the other side of it.
Bartlett before, and that's it. Thank you, Kevin. Bartlett, you want to come in here?
So I did, I quite enjoyed the battering of lawyers earlier, but what I would suggest is this. It discloses a deeper sort of challenge with how we operate in the Caribbean generally, not just in ICT spheres, but generally, which is we tend to go towards silos first as opposed to being collaborative first. That is the real underlying cultural sort of problem that we need to address. And there are lots of reasons for it. I mean, as you'll very often know, and one of the things I've observed as being sort of someone who straddles the divide between ICT and a legal practice is that very often there's a certain vulnerability that comes with speaking to a professional from another space and sort of exposing your own ignorance. It's hard to admit that you don't know. And so because of that, we tend to go into silos where we only talk to other people like ourselves, which is that's a big part of the underlying problem. The other part of the challenge that we're facing right now in the region is that governments, and this is they don't seem to appreciate the importance of meaningful, broad-based consultations across stakeholder groups. And so invariably what you find happening is you basically have an end product, it's given to you, and if you're lucky, they may open comments for a brief period of time and tell nobody that the comments are open for that little piece of legislation. And then before you know it, it's passed, it's the law, and that's the end of the story. That is hugely, hugely problematic because it means that the leading thinkers in the relative areas aren't having an opportunity to actually dive in, to look at it, to spin it around, to say, well, I think this is fit for purpose, or this may not be fit for purpose. And so we're missing lots of opportunities because what will happen is in our rush to get legislation passed, we pass legislation that doesn't actually help us. It doesn't actually aid development. It doesn't actually achieve the purposes that we set out to achieve. And to my mind, that's a big part of the underlying challenge that we faced, as exemplified by the hip card challenge.
Thank you for saying that. We have three more. We're going to take three more. SG, Deirdre, and Maria. And then we have to shut down, yes?
Bartlett has hit the nail on the head. If you're talking about a Caribbean single market and economy, if you're talking about a CARICOM single ICT space, those things cannot work without governments collaborating in a meaningful way, because you have to harmonize the policies, the legislation, the regulations. And you hear the talk is definitely there, but they do not talk. They do not collaborate. And this is what we have to push for. Because at our level, yes, we could talk about it and come up with principles. But if the governments are not prepared to cooperate and collaborate and share this information and say, yes, St. Vincent, I did this, let's try this. And that is the sort of conversation that needs to be happening on a regular, consistent basis for us to really present as a single space, a single Caribbean ICT space. Thank you.
Thank you, ST. Deidre, and then we go to Maria. Maria, you have a mic. Continue.
I want to say well said, because the truth is we need to collaborate. And it's not just going to the ministry and their technocrats. And it has to be in a focus group. It has to be with people on the ground. We know when we build policy, we go to the people in the field. Long gone are the days where we sit in an office and go through a document and approve it. It will not work. And collaboration throughout the region. These type of forums, I mean, these 2 days have been the greatest days. Can I say that to you? Where we all talk and we all learn from each other and we don't feel that any one opinion is wrong, but we get together and we collaborate and we agree on one common ground. So technology is dynamic and especially in my space, because there are many, many incidents I can cite where they mix up interference as for signal with the storing of data. And this was written into law and a case was passed because somebody didn't understand what was the difference between storing data on a computer versus storing a signal, which you can't.
Yes, we know of that too. Deidre, you wanted to come in, yes?
Yes, please, if I may. In defense of lawyers, the hip car experience in St. Lucia, at least, was wonderful. There were 20 or 30 of us in the room, and the legal drafters, some of them imported, were also wonderful. They listened really carefully to what we were saying, and everyone was very patient. Now, one thing I would say, some of the people, some of those 30 in that room didn't say anything. They were listening, I'm sure, but they didn't say anything, and perhaps there should be more compulsion on actually contributing. As a further model, ECLAC consults broadly. They don't have love-ins for their consultations usually. They broadcast the whatever it is and ask for comments. Again, people may have been invited to comment and they don't comment, and that's, for them to comment should be encouraged. But the thing I really want to say, for those of us who were here earlier this week, the thing that was drummed into our heads is that for the 21st century governance and for the future state to work, you need an individual ID. And that ID is linked to all sorts of other information. It might have been interesting in this workshop to use that ID as the framework of how we look at privacy regulation, so that instead of having two things at the opposite ends of the spectrum, you have two ideas that have been introduced to each other and are trying to find where they can be mutually compatible, where they need to protect one another. Thanks.
Thank you.
And this was a great panel. Thank you.
Can we, this one, I'm going to give Gabriel an opportunity.
I'm going to be very, very short, I promise.
Yes.
But thanks for this interesting discussion. You know, as a data company, we're always like very interested and excited about like participating in this type of discussions. So a lot has been spoken about principles. as a way forward of thinking of a broad Caribbean framework. And in that sense, just wanted to mention that we, Google, have published last year like a very overbroad, high-level privacy framework of what we see that works in terms of data regimes that protect users' right to privacy, but also enable innovation. And I think that's it's not a long document. I can share it with all of you later. But out of all those principles, I think two are especially important for the Caribbean. One is taking into account that every privacy framework needs to be applicable to all sectors of economy and not only focus to data companies, because all companies across all sectors are now data companies. So it has to have that objective in mind of analyzing how a privacy regime can affect traditional sectors of the economy that are using data to provide better services and products. And the other point that I wanted to remark is making sure that that allows interoperability across nations. And I think that's especially important for Caribbean, which rely on the economic interactions between each of them. So just making sure that the framework that you think, or that we think together for the Caribbean region, is adapted to the reality of Caribbean nations and the economic relationships between Caribbean nations. So looking forward to contribute to this discussion and share our other insights.
Yes, even this guy, one gentleman at the back, he's been waiting for a long time, and then we have to close off the discussion. Nigel is ringing his bell here, so we're gonna have to shut down. Yes.
Right. So the comment is based on the last statement from the gentleman from Google.
Yeah.
If my data is given to a data provider, regardless of sector, there must be a way for me to access that at some point, and two, that's from a user perspective. From a system integrator perspective, if I build a system and some information from my system goes to yours, there must be a way of me knowing not what I send, but if what I send to you, what you're using it for. Because it could be a case where our regional developer builds something, or for example, we saw the solution from Grenada. They have these sensors, and we get into the value conversation, and the data is rolled up at a national level, and they expand, let's say, in 5 islands or 7 islands, and it runs on another platform or integrates to another platform. That data then can be used by that other platform to get some level of value. The local developer, or the one who puts in the work to get it to that level, would not get any value from that data after it's been rolled up into another platform. So helping the local ICT sector, the knowledge-based society, to get value for the data that's been put out there is also a key part of the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, we have to close off, unfortunately. Nigel wants to get on with his thing here. We want to thank all of you for participating in this. I think we have some principles, and I think we have decided that it is somehow going to be linked to the movement along the single ICT space framework, SG. And we will have further and better discussions. And please understand my reference to lawyers. I have lots of friends who are lawyers, but I said that the law is too important to leave it to lawyers. I want to be in the room with the lawyers. That is the difference. Thank you all very much.